Contention: taxpayers can refuse to pay income taxes on religious or moral grounds by invoking the First Amendment. Look, in that term there, taxpayer, it shows up again. It shows up everywhere. If you're a taxpayer, you're subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax. That's what the definition of the term is. So, and then, if they're taxing certain occupations, and you engage in those occupations, you don't have to engage in them, or you're engaging in an activity that the Congress makes taxable, to turn around and argue that you don't have to pay taxes because of a First Amendment basis is not going to hold water. Wouldn't hold water if I was in that court, if I was a judge in that court. But again, you got to keep in mind they're using that term taxpayers. Let's say, and why would you argue I'm a taxpayer but I don't have to pay the tax because it's on religious grounds? I go back to what activity am I engaged in that is subject to the Internal Revenue Code? Where have I been made liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax? And not saying I don't have to pay because of religious grounds. And the next one, federal income taxes constitutes of taking a property without due process of law, violating the Fifth Amendment. Again, if you're engaged in a revenue taxable activity that's listed in the code, and you decide to engage in that voluntarily knowing that there's a tax there. But you see, all those indirect taxes, that's the cute thing about them. They're on, say for example, there's an excise tax on gasoline. Well, the people who are actually paying that tax are people that buy the gasoline, right? So the manufacturer is not paying that tax, and it's the same on every activity that's imposed in the code. So, under that basis, whose property is being taken involuntarily on an excise tax for gasoline? You could say, well, I've got no choice, I got to buy the gasoline. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. The Amish would argue with you. But it's not taking your property without, and your consent in that regard. And so federal income taxes constitutes taking a property without due process of law, violating the Fifth Amendment. Is just a spurious argument. Doesn't hold water, wouldn't hold water with me. All right. Contention: taxpayers do not have to file returns or provide financial information because of the protection against self-incrimination found in the Fifth Amendment. Again, if there is no tax imposed on you, you're not engaged in any revenue taxable activity listed in the Internal Revenue Code. You're just assuming they got a right to take a portion of your earnings because they labeled a tax, or they label a so-called tax income, and I say so-called because, they put a tax on something nebulous like taxable income. Hereby imposes the tax on taxable income. It's not like when they impose the tax on gas-guzzling vehicles. It's pretty obvious. And then they make the manufacturer liable for the tax. They're the ones got to pay it. But they don't actually pay it, do they? Because it goes into, that's right, the sticker price of the vehicle. So taxpayers do not have to file returns or provide financial information because of the protections against self-incrimination found in the Fifth Amendment. Bad argument. If you're a taxpayer and you're engaged in any of those revenue taxable activities, you've done so voluntarily, and so why would it be objectionable for you to provide these informations? That's part of the game. Provide that information. Of course, all those being big companies, do they really care? I mean, when I say big companies, a distillation of alcoholic spirits, or even the tobacco taxes and whatnot, where the consumer ultimately pays the price. So disclosing information from Reynolds Tobacco or Jack Daniel's whiskey distillers, they don't care. It's really no big deal. But to argue that you don't have to file a return because it violates your Fifth Amendment is to really argue also that there is a tax imposed on you, that you are a taxpayer, but you're not going to do it because it violates your Fifth Amendment. Bad argument. Contention: the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was not properly ratified. Thus, the federal tax laws are unconstitutional. federal tax. Notice how they do that. See, the 16th Amendment, whether it did, for example, let's say it was not properly ratified. That wouldn't vitiate all federal tax laws, because there's plenty of federal tax laws that have no outlet. You know what I mean about the 16th Amendment. They don't affect it. All right? So, to make the IRS making these things, or anybody making that all federal tax laws are unconstitutional because the 16th Amendment wasn't properly ratified. Well, I say it's a bad argument to say I don't have to pay taxes because the 16th Amendment wasn't, or income taxes, because the 16th Amendment wasn't properly ratified. Why? Because in two Supreme Court cases, Brushaber and Stanton, they both, the court there said that the 16th Amendment did not give Congress any new power. All right, so it still had to operate on the same power that it had before. So that doesn't invalidate the idea of, if it wasn't properly ratified and it gave Congress no new power, so why would you argue it wasn't properly ratified when it gave Congress no new power? It isn't the argument whether or not you've been made liable or subject for or to an Internal Revenue Code tax. Next, the 16th Amendment does not authorize a direct, non-apportioned federal income tax on United States citizens. All right, and that's to argue that that the income tax, so-called income tax, is a direct, non-apportioned tax. And why would you want to argue that? Supreme Court doesn't consider it that. And isn't the key the same thing again, once again? Where have you been made subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax? Fictional legal basis. Next thing. Contention. The Internal Revenue Service is not an agency of the United States. Again, same thing I've been belaboring here. Contention. Taxpayers are not required to file a federal income tax return because the instructions and regulations associated with a Form 1040 do not display an OMB control number as required by the Paperwork Reduction Act. Again, somebody could argue that, and again, maybe some courts would agree with them, but isn't the bottom line, where have you been made subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax? Contention. African Americans can claim a special tax credit as reparations for slavery and other oppressive treatment. I don't have to make a comment on that. Taxpayers are entitled to a refund of the Social Security taxes paid over their lifetime. You know, again, and that Social Security is another one. Where have you been made liable or subject to a Social Security tax in the Internal Revenue Code? Contention. An untaxing package or trust provides a way of legally and permanently avoiding the obligation to file federal income tax returns and pay federal income taxes. I'm not going to cover that. A contention. A corporation sole, these are in quotes, can be established and used for the purpose of avoiding federal income taxes. That's another thing. It's like, you know the theme I've been going over. Contention. Taxpayers who did not purchase and use fuel for an off-highway business can claim the fuel tax credits. And that's again arguing in the taxpayer box. I don't even address that. A Form 1099 OID can be used as a debt payment option, or the form or a purported financial instrument may be used to obtain money from the Treasury. Who knows? You see, this stuff can go on and on. Frivolous arguments in collection due process cases. Invalidity of assessment. Contention. A tax assessment is invalid because the taxpayer did not get a copy of the Form 23C. The Form 23C was not personally signed by the Secretary of the Treasury, or Form 23C is not a valid record of assessment. And the argument there is, if you sent a form into the IRS and you said you owed so much money, basically you told them you owed the money, and if they turn around and enter that into their books, you assessed yourself, didn't you? I'd say it would be the end of the game there. But what if you didn't do that and they turned around and said you owe this money? Well, did they actually make an assessment? There's another process on how you deal with that and look for that. All right. Next, contention, a tax assessment is invalid because the assessment was made from a substitute for return prepared pursuant to Section 6020B, which is not a valid return. All right, well, if you didn't make a return and they made one for you on your behalf without your consent, well, that's one thing, and I would like to see a copy of it if I were you. And, of course, I would like to see a copy of any assessment. But to say that the assessment was invalid because they made a 60/20, they made a return on that on your behalf, and they didn't have the authority to do that, I'd rather see a copy of their so-called substitute for return, who signed it, and if somebody had the authority under that Section 6020B. Okay. Then the invalidity of the statutory notice of deficiency. This is further in the game, and people are going to say this statute of deficiency is not valid, and their contention is a statutory notice of deficiency is invalid because it was not signed by the Secretary of the Treasury or by somebody with delegated authority. And another contention, a statutory notice of deficiency is invalid because the taxpayer did not file an income tax return. All right. Well, if you were subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code, it wouldn't matter if you filed a return, right? It'd be there and you're subject or liable to it. And so if there was such a deficiency notice, how would it be invalid if you're actually subject to or liable for a tax? Wouldn't the underlying question always be what code section imposed a duty or an obligation on me? What code section made me a taxpayer, made me liable for or subject to an Internal Revenue Code tax? And, what activity am I engaging in that, you say makes me subject to the tax? That's what's imperative, that there's a code section that imposes the obligation or duty on you, and they use it if they say this imposes a tax or an obligation on a taxpayer. How did you become a taxpayer? Taxpayer is someone who has been made liable to or for an Internal Revenue Code tax. Liability, liability.